The starting pistol had not even finished its echo across the Oklahoma plains when Lenora Vaughn heard the laughter. It was not the laughter of people caught up in excitement. It was not the laughter of neighbors carried away by the wild spectacle of 2,000 riders launching themselves across a sea of golden grass at the same desperate moment. It was directed at her, and she knew it the way a person knows the particular sting of a wound that was meant to land exactly where it did. "Look at her," said a woman in a blue bonnet, loudly enough to be heard over the thunder of hooves, "riding out there like she belongs among them." "She'll fall off before she clears the creek," said a man beside her, and the cluster of townspeople gathered at the starting line erupted in agreement. Lenora did not fall off. She leaned low over the neck of the horse beneath her and felt the animal respond like a living flame, surging forward with a power and grace she had never experienced in her 24 years of riding. She had ridden draft horses as a girl. She had borrowed tired mares from neighbors. She had once, desperately, ridden a mule 14 miles in the rain to reach a doctor for her dying mother. But she had never, in all her life, ridden anything like this. The horse's name was Covenant, and she had not chosen him. He had been chosen for her. She had arrived at the starting line that morning with a borrowed saddle and no horse at all, her registered claim ticket crumpled in the pocket of her riding coat, her plan crumbling around her like a building in a windstorm. The man who had promised to sell her a sound horse for the race had taken her $63 the night before and vanished from the boarding house before dawn, leaving only the smell of tobacco and betrayal in his empty room. She had stood at the edge of the gathered riders with nothing, and she had understood with cold and complete clarity that she was going to lose everything she had spent 3 years planning, saving, and sacrificing to achieve. That was when John Donnelly had appeared. She had not known his name then. She had known only that a man in a dust-colored hat had walked a horse through the crowd with quiet, deliberate purpose, leading it directly to her as though he had always known where she was standing. The horse was a black gelding with a white blaze down its nose and legs that looked carved from a description of what a perfect horse should be. The man had offered her the reins without a word at first, and she had stared at him as though he had walked out of a dream she had been too practical to ever allow herself. "He'll run all day if you ask him right," the man had said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. "And you look like someone who needs a horse." "I cannot accept this," she had said, because she was Lenora Vaughn and she had been raised to accept nothing she had not earned. "You can give him back after," he had said. And then he had walked away into the crowd, and the starting pistol had fired, and there had been no time left for argument or pride or any of the 1,000 sensible objections she had been assembling in her mind. Now she was riding Covenant across the Oklahoma Territory in the land race of April 22, 1889, and nobody was cheering for her except, she realized when she glanced back once at the dissolving starting line, one man in a dust-colored hat who stood apart from all the laughing townspeople with his hands at his sides, watching her go. She turned back to the horizon and rode. The land stretched before her in every direction like something God had not finished deciding about. The grass was short and the color of old honey, broken in long rolling waves by limestone outcroppings, and the occasional dark line of a creek cutting through the earth as though the land had been sliced open to show what it was made of. The sky above was the blue that April produces before summer burns it pale, deep and serious and full of weather that had not arrived yet. Around her, the world was chaos. 2,000 riders had erupted from the starting line at the same moment, and the first minutes of the race had been pure disorder, horses shoulder to shoulder, men shouting, women bent low over their saddles, the entire human flood spreading outward across the territory in the search for the quarter sections of land that the government had opened for settlement. You had to reach your chosen plot, drive your stake, and hold it. That was the entirety of the law on this day. Lenora knew exactly where she was going. She had studied the survey maps for 6 months, had paid a surveyor in Guthrie $2 of her precious dollars to explain the township markings to her, had memorized the landmarks. She was riding for a particular quarter section in the eastern portion of the newly opened territory, where a creek made a bend, and the soil darkened, and there was, according to every piece of information she had gathered, good farmland waiting for the person who arrived first to claim it. She had watched men file the same information in their heads and ride for the same land. She had understood that every person at that starting line was carrying a secret map in their mind, and that many of those maps pointed to the same places. The only answer was to be faster, smarter, and more determined than the people pointing at the same destination. Covenant ate the ground beneath his hooves as though it were an insult he intended to correct. Lenora understood within the first half-mile that this horse was extraordinary. He was not simply fast. He was intelligent about his speed, picking his footing through the uneven ground without breaking stride, reading the terrain with the kind of animal wisdom that could not be trained into a horse that did not already have it. Whoever had trained this horse had done it with patience and respect, and the horse had given back tenfold what had been invested. She thought of the man who had given him to her and felt something complicated move through her chest. She pushed it aside. There was no room for complicated things right now. The creek crossing came at roughly the 3-mile mark, and this was where the race began to sort itself. The water was running fast from spring rain, and the bank was steep and treacherous. Lenora saw 2 horses refuse the crossing entirely, spinning in tight, frantic circles while their riders fought for control. She saw a man go into the water when his horse stumbled on the bank, and she heard his cry cut off by the cold current. She could not stop for him. She understood that other riders were behind her and that someone would reach him, and she pressed that knowledge against her conscience and kept riding. Covenant took the crossing without hesitation. He gathered himself 3 strides before the bank, adjusted his footing once on the near edge, and launched them both into the water with a clean, powerful leap that landed them in the current chest deep, for only a moment before his hooves found the gravel of the far side, and he surged up the opposite bank, as though he had been waiting for a chance to demonstrate exactly this. Lenora stayed with him through every second of it, her weight balanced perfectly over his center, her hands soft on the reins, and she heard herself laugh out loud for the first time in longer than she could remember. The sound surprised her. She had not laughed like that since before her mother died. She put the surprise aside and rode harder. The land she was aiming for was another 4 miles east and slightly north, and she could see from the positions of the riders around her that she was not alone in her heading. 2 men were riding roughly parallel to her, close enough that she could read the tension in their postures, the way they were watching her the way a river watches a rock, waiting for the moment they could flow around it and leave it behind. She recognized one of them. His name was Carter Sims, and he was a land speculator from Kansas City who had been at the boarding house where she stayed, and who had made it abundantly clear over 3 days of conversation that he did not believe a woman had any business filing a land claim in the Oklahoma territory. He had said it with the particular brand of politeness that is more offensive than open contempt, wrapping his dismissal in friendly advice and the implication that she should be grateful for the counsel. She had been civil to him because she needed information and he had too much of it. She had listened and learned and told him nothing true about her own plans. He was riding a big bay horse that was fast but not as fast as Covenant, and she could see the moment he understood this because his posture changed, something tightening in his shoulders when she began to pull ahead. He cut toward her. It was not an accident. He angled his horse deliberately into her path, close enough that his horse's shoulder was almost touching Covenant's flank, crowding her, forcing her to choose between pulling up or riding into the rougher ground to her right, where a limestone shelf broke the surface of the grass. Lenora did not pull up. She did not go right. She made a third choice that she suspected Carter Sims had not included in his calculation. She gave Covenant a clear signal with her leg and her seat, a subtle but decisive shift that communicated exactly what she needed, and the horse responded by shortening his stride just enough to let Sim's horse surge forward a half length. And then she pushed Covenant left, and through the gap that appeared between Sim's and the other rider, slipping through like water, finding the space between stones. She heard Sims shout something behind her. She did not catch the words, and she did not particularly want to. She was in front. She stayed in front for the remaining 4 miles, and when the bend in the creek came into view, that darkening of the soil that she had seen on maps and in her dreams for 6 months, she felt her heart do something that was not strictly a medical event but felt like one. She pulled Covenant to a canter, then a trot as she approached the land, reading the stakes already driven into the neighboring sections, confirming her position against the landmarks she had memorized. The quarter section was unclaimed. She reached into the saddlebag she had packed 3 days ago and retrieved the stake she had cut and sharpened and prepared herself, and she drove it into the earth with the back of a small hatchet she had borrowed from the widow who ran the boarding house. 3 solid strikes and the stake held. She sat back on her heels in the grass and looked at the land around her. 800 acres. Hers, by law, by right, and by the work of every day she had spent preparing for this moment. She thought about the horse beneath her, patient and breathing steadily, and she thought about the man who had given him to her. She needed to find John Donnelly. It took her 4 hours to make the slow ride back to the starting town, which was already in the process of becoming something else entirely as settlers poured back from their claims, and the tent city that had been rising for days transformed itself into something more permanent. She led Covenant carefully through the congestion of wagons and horses and shouting people, past the makeshift land offices, where clerks were already overwhelmed with the paperwork of 1,000 dreams, past the argument happening at the edge of the road between 2 men who had both staked the same plot and were explaining their grievances to each other at considerable volume. She found John Donnelly at the edge of town, sitting on a fence rail beside the temporary horse corral, his hat pushed back on his head, watching the chaos of the arriving settlers with the calm expression of a man who has made his peace with the world being loud. He was 31 years old. She would learn later, though he looked both younger and older than that depending on the angle of the light. He had dark hair showing under the hat and hands that spoke of genuine labor, not the decorative kind. He was not a pretty man, but he was a real one, which was rarer and more valuable. He saw her coming and stood up from the fence rail without haste, and something in his face when he looked at her changed in a way that was visible even at a distance. "You're back," he said. "I got the land," she said, "and your horse is sound and unhurt, which is more than I can say for my dignity, so here we are." A smile moved across his face slowly, like sunrise rather than lamplight, taking its time but warming everything it touched. "Did you stake it?" 3 strikes, she said. "The stake isn't going anywhere." She offered him Covenant's reins, and he took them, and his fingers brushed hers in the transfer, and she felt that brushing all the way up her arm and would have been very irritated about it if she had not been too tired to manage proper irritation. "I owe you an enormous debt," she said, "and I don't carry debts comfortably, so I need to know what you want for the loan of him." He looked at her for a long moment. The noise of the settling town moved around them like a river moving around stones. "I don't want anything," he said. "That's not a real answer," she said. "It's the only one I've got right now," he said. "My name is John Donnelly." "Lenora Vaughn," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "You signed the race registration yesterday morning," he said. "I was standing behind you in the line." "And you remembered my name from a line," she said. "I remembered your name," he said, and the simplicity of it, without explanation or excuse, hit her somewhere vulnerable that she had not known was exposed. She did not know what to say to that, which was a deeply unfamiliar experience for Lenora Vaughn, who had spent most of her adult life knowing exactly what to say to almost everything. She settled on practicality as her escape route. "I need to get to the land office before they close," she said, "to file the claim properly." "I'll walk with you if you don't mind," he said. She minded very much and said she did not mind at all, and they walked together through the chaos of the newborn town, and she was aware of him beside her in the way you are aware of the edge of a cliff you are walking close to, not frightened exactly, but thoroughly awake. The land office was a madhouse of a different kind than the race had been. The building was a frame structure that had been put up in the past week, smelling of raw lumber and too many people, and every inch of it was occupied by settlers trying to file claims, argue about claims, contest other people's claims, or simply stand in line long enough that they hoped the problem would resolve itself. Lenora joined the line with the calm efficiency of someone who had expected exactly this and brought water and patience accordingly. John Donnelly waited outside with his horse. She was inside for 2 hours. When she emerged with her claim filed and her receipt folded carefully into the inner pocket of her coat, the sun was low and the shadows were long, and John Donnelly was still there. He had Covenant on a lead rope, and he had evidently used the time to water both horses and acquire, from somewhere in the chaos of the street, 2 paper-wrapped parcels that turned out to contain cold roast beef sandwiches. He offered her one without comment. She took it without comment. They stood in the street together and ate, and the evening light came down golden and warm on everything, turning the raw new town beautiful in the way that dying light turns everything beautiful. And Lenora allowed herself 1 full minute of feeling all of it, the solid reality of the claim receipt in her pocket, the exhaustion in her legs, the way the bread was fresh enough that the boarding house woman must have baked that morning, and the fact that the man standing beside her had given up his best horse for a stranger and was now apparently incapable of leaving until he knew she was fed. Then she folded the paper from her sandwich and put it in the pocket with her receipt and said, "Why did you give me your horse?" John Donnelly was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that thinks rather than avoids. "My father came to Kansas with nothing," he said at last. 1867. He walked in with $40 and a mule and a wife who was 7 months along with me, and there was not a single person who came out to the road to help him or wish him well. He built something anyway, because he was that kind of man. But he told me once that it would have changed something in him if one person had simply helped without being asked. He looked at the street rather than at her. "I don't know if that's an answer to your question." "It is," she said. "It's a good one." They looked at each other, and the evening light did what evening light always does, which is make things clearer rather than darker, as though the lowering of the sun allows the actual truth of things to become briefly visible. "What are your plans for the land?" he asked. "Farm it," she said. "I know that sounds simple. It is not simple, I know that. I have $42 left in the world and a land claim and a set of skills I have been building for 4 years because I knew I was going to need them. I can drive a team. I can plant and harvest wheat. I can build a sod house because I have done it before on my father's land when I was 18. I have a list of what I need to acquire and an order in which to acquire it." She paused. "I know how I sound." "How do you sound?" he said. "Like someone who has practiced this speech for people who are about to tell me it cannot be done," she said. "I wasn't going to say that," he said. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to ask if you needed help," he said, "and then tell you that I have a crew that is coming in 2 weeks to help me build on my own claim, which is about 6 miles north of yours, and that I know how to frame a soddy and I've done it in a week with 3 men when the weather cooperated." She stared at him. "Your claim is 6 miles north." "I filed 3 days ago," he said. "I came early to scout, which is how I knew about the survey lines and the creek bend. I had already chosen my land before the race." "Then you weren't racing today," she said. "No," he said. "You were just standing at the starting line watching," she said, and the thing that had been forming slowly in her chest since the moment he handed her the reins began to take a shape she could almost name. "I was watching to see if you got a horse," he said. The silence between them after that was a different kind of silence than the ones that had preceded it. It had weight to it, and warmth, and she felt it pressing gently against her from all sides like something that wanted to become permanent. "You knew I had no horse," she said. "I saw the man leave," he said. "Early morning. He had a horse that wasn't his and saddlebags that were too full. I had seen him talking to you the day before and I understood what had happened. "You could have told me sooner," she said, and there was an edge in her voice that surprised her, because underneath it was a feeling she was not entirely prepared to examine, a feeling that had to do with the fact that someone had been watching out for her without her knowledge, which she had no framework for and therefore found alarming. "I figured you needed to decide for yourself whether to take the horse," he said. "If I had come to you an hour before and explained everything and offered him then, it would have felt different. You would have had time to refuse." "I still could have refused at the line," she said. "No," he said with the gentlest possible certainty. "You couldn't. You're not the kind of person who refuses when the only other option is giving up everything you've worked for." She should have found that presumptuous. She found it accurate, which was more unsettling. "John Donnelly," she said slowly, tasting the name. "What is it that you do exactly when you are not handing over your best horses to strangers at land races?" "I ranch," he said. "Or I will. I've been foreman on a spread in Texas for 5 years, saved enough to do this. Cattle mostly, but I know crops." He looked at her with those direct, unhurried eyes. "What were you doing before this?" "Teaching school," she said. "In Missouri, for 4 years. I saved every dollar that was not needed for food and lodging, and I read everything I could find about dryland farming and Oklahoma Territory soil composition, and I prepared." "While teaching school," he said. "Children are not in school all day," she said, "and the evenings are long." Something in him shifted, a deepening of that particular quality of attention he gave her, as though he had been looking carefully before and was now looking more carefully still. "You planned this for 4 years," he said. "My mother died and left me with nothing and a brother who needed to be sent to an apprenticeship in St. Louis, which took the last of the estate," she said, with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who has processed grief into fuel. "I needed land. I needed something that was mine that no one could take away because I hadn't been quick enough or lucky enough or born the right kind of person. Oklahoma Territory was the answer to that, and the race was the answer to Oklahoma Territory. So I prepared. And someone stole your horse money," he said. "Someone stole my horse money," she confirmed. "And then you appeared. And gave you covenant," he said. "And gave me covenant," she said. "Which means that either you are a very unusual man or I am very unlucky in that specific way that turns out to be lucky at the last moment." The smile came back, slower this time, more certain of itself. "Maybe both," he said. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the light completed its transition from gold to copper to the first blue hint of dusk, and then she said, "I will accept your offer of help with the building. I will pay for materials and cook for your crew. That is a fair arrangement, and I will not argue about it." "I wasn't planning to argue," he said. "You might have," she said. "I might have," he agreed. They arranged to meet the following week to begin planning. He gave her directions to his camp outside of town, near the Spring Creek, and she gave him nothing in return because she was camping in a boarding house room, and the directions were simply the name of the boarding house on the main street, which was not yet called anything but everyone called the Main Street, because it was the only paved thing in the county. She walked back to her room in the blue dusk with her claim receipt in her coat, and the ghost of that light touch on her fingers when she had given him the reins, and she sat on the edge of her narrow boarding house bed and held both of those things in her mind and thought very carefully and deliberately about what she was going to do about John Donnelly. She decided she was going to be sensible. She was going to use the help he was offering because she was not a fool, and she was going to remain clear-eyed about her purpose, which was the land and the farm and the life she was building, not the feeling that had moved through her arm when his hand had brushed hers. She was a practical woman. She had been practical her entire life. Practicality had gotten her this far, and it would carry her the rest of the way. She slept very well that night, which surprised her, and dreamed of nothing she could remember in the morning. 2 weeks moved with the particular speed of weeks that are full. Lenora made her first visit to her land claim on the 3rd day after the race, riding a rented horse from the livery at considerable expense, and spent 6 hours walking every inch of the quarter section she had staked. She tested the soil with her hands, crumbling it between her fingers to feel its composition, finding the clay layer that would need to be broken, and the richer topsoil above it that told her what she needed to know. She found the spring that the survey map had marked as merely a seasonal feature, and discovered it was running clean and strong even in April, which meant it would likely survive the summer. She wept once, standing at the highest point of the land where the creek bent away to the east, and the whole of it spread before her in the afternoon sun. And then she stopped weeping and made notes in the small, leather-covered notebook she carried everywhere. She went to the General Mercantile, which was operating out of a tent because the building was not yet framed, and she made a list of seed prices and tool prices and lumber prices. And she did arithmetic in her notebook until the numbers balanced against her $42 in a way that required the sod house option rather than the wood frame option. And she made peace with that, because she had built a soddy before, and it was not the worst thing. It was, in fact, a remarkable piece of engineering if you did it right, which she intended to do. She had 3 conversations with John Donnelly in those 2 weeks. The first was at the makeshift feed store on the 4th day, when they encountered each other in the line to price out seed corn, and talked for 40 minutes about soil preparation and the relative merits of strip farming, while the line behind them grew impatient. The second was at the land office dispute hearing on the 9th day, where Carter Sims had filed a contest against her claim on the grounds that she had crossed the starting line illegally early. The accusation was a fabrication so brazen it had a kind of audacity to it, and she had spent 2 days gathering statements from other riders who had been positioned near her at the start. John Donnelly had appeared at the hearing as one of those witnesses, and when he stood before the land office commissioner and stated quietly and with complete authority that he had been watching Lenora Vaughn at the starting line and that she had not moved until the pistol fired, the commissioner had dismissed Sims' contest within the hour. Sims had stared at Donnelly on the way out of the hearing with an expression that contained several dark and specific things, and John had looked back at him with the calm of someone who has already decided what he will and will not tolerate. "He won't let this go," Lenora had said, outside in the street after. "Probably not," John had said. "Men like that tend to need a project. Then we need to make sure the claim is airtight," she had said, and he had nodded once, and they had separated back to their respective preparations. The third conversation had been on the evening of the 13th day, when he had appeared at the boarding house door with his hat in his hands to tell her that his building crew was arriving in the morning, and that if she wanted to start on the sod house first, they could redirect the effort there. She had stood in the boarding house doorway in the early evening light and looked at him and said yes, and she had been aware the entire time of the landlady's interested and deeply unsubtle observation from the parlor window. The building of the sod house took 8 days. 8 days of labor that Lenora found herself looking back on, in later years, as some of the best days of her life, which she would have found astonishing if someone had told her so at the time, because they were also 8 of the most physically demanding, exhausting, and occasionally humiliating days she had ever experienced. Cutting sod was brutal work. The heavy iron-bladed plow John's crew used to cut the strips was pulled by a team that Lenora drove herself on the 3rd day, because one of the crew members had a bad shoulder, and she refused to stand by watching while someone else hurt themselves doing her work. She drove the team with the competence of someone who had done it young and not forgotten, and she could feel from the quality of silence behind her the particular recalibration that happens in a group of men when a woman does something they had not expected her to be able to do. John Donnelly said nothing about it. He simply noted it and moved on. She respected him enormously for that. The sod was cut in strips and stacked into walls with careful, alternating layering, grass side down, each strip interlocking with the one below it in the same principle as brick, but with the additional understanding that the roots of the grass would knit the whole structure together over time into something that could be more weatherproof than wood in a plains windstorm. The crew knew their work. John directed without hovering, working as hard as any of the others, which she noticed even when she was focused on her own tasks. A man who does not ask others to do what he will not do himself is a specific kind of man, and she had not encountered enough of them to take it for granted. The days established a rhythm. Early mornings belonged to the work and to the particular hush of the territory before the heat built. Evenings, after the crew ate the meal she cooked over the fire she built, belonged to something less definable. The crew drifted away to their camp a quarter-mile off, and she and John sat by the dying fire and talked. They talked about everything, and they talked about nothing, and they talked about the things that fall out of people in the hours between the end of labor and the beginning of sleep, the hours when pretense is too expensive to maintain. She told him about her mother, Margaret Vaughn, who had been a schoolteacher herself, and who had died of a lung fever 2 winters ago, slowly and then all at once, with the terrible injustice of a death that steals a person who had so much more to give. He told her about his father, a man named Thomas Donnelly who had built in Kansas and lost it in the drought of 1880 and rebuilt, and lost it again in the winter of 1887, and died that spring of a heart that had simply run out of the specific kind of strength required to lose things and begin again. He spoke of his father with a love that was entirely clear of sentimentality, which was the most genuine kind. He would have liked this territory, John said, on the 5th evening, looking at the sky that was fully dark now and blazing with stars in the way that only open country sky blazes, without the interference of towns or trees. He would have said it was too flat because he loved the Kansas hills, but he would have known it was the kind of land that rewards patience. "Does it?" she said. "Most good land does," he said. "The kind that gives you everything right away is never as reliable." She was looking at the stars rather than at him. "Is that a principle you apply broadly?" she said. The silence he left before answering told her that he understood exactly what she was really asking. "Yes," he said. "I find it's generally sound." She pulled her knees up to her chest and watched a meteor scribe a quick silver line across the south portion of the sky and disappear before she could fully observe it. "I am not a simple undertaking," she said, because she believed in saying the true thing even when the true thing was self-implicating. "I know," he said. "I have land and a claim and plans that involve the next 20 years in specific detail," she said. "I don't have room in those plans for complications." "Plans change," he said. "Good ones do anyway. The best plans are the ones that know how to grow to fit what actually happens." She turned her head and looked at him then in the firelight, and he was looking back at her with that particular quality of attention that she had come to understand was simply the way he looked at her, steady and unashamed, the way a person looks at something they have decided matters to them. "John Donnelly," she said, "you are a complication." "Lenora Vaughn," he said, "so are you." On the 6th day, Carter Sims appeared. He came in the late afternoon with 2 men behind him, and a constable's badge that Lenora was nearly certain had not existed that morning, and he stood at the edge of her property with the air of someone who has been practicing his entrance. He said that there was a question about the survey markers on the southern boundary of her claim, and that an official measurement was required before she could continue building, and that until that measurement was complete, all construction must cease. Lenora listened to this without moving or changing her expression, which was a practiced skill. John had come to stand beside her at some point during Sim's speech, and he was also very still, in the way that quiet animals are still before they move with tremendous speed. "Who ordered this measurement?" Lenora said. "The Territorial Land Office," Sims said. "I will need the written order," she said. A flicker of something moved through Sim's face. He had not expected her to ask for the written order. "It will be produced," he said. "Then I will cease construction when I see it," she said. "Until then, we continue." Sims left with his hired men and his probably fraudulent badge, and Lenora waited until he was out of sight before she allowed herself to exhale. John put a hand briefly on her shoulder, one solid and uncomplicated touch, and then took it away. "He's going to keep coming," she said. "Yes," John said. "Because he wants this land," she said. "The creek bend, specifically. Someone told him what the land is worth." "I know who told him," John said, and his voice had a different quality in it, something with an edge that she had not heard before. She turned to look at him. "Who?" "The surveyor you paid in Guthrie," John said. "His name is Webb. He and Sims have been working together for months, filing information about the best plots for Sims' land speculation company. He took your $2 and your information and sold it." The betrayal was not surprising exactly. She had learned enough about the land rush to know that corruption was threaded through it at every level, that the entire apparatus of the race was riddled with people who had decided that the legal process was a framework to be gamed rather than a system to be trusted. But the specific nature of this betrayal, the fact that the information she had worked to gather had been weaponized against her, produced a cold and precise anger that was very clarifying. "How do you know this?" she said. "I've been watching Sims since before the race," John said. "I had a dispute with a man in Texas who used the same methods, and I recognized the pattern. I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long time, measuring the honesty in that admission against the annoyance she felt at being kept from information she needed, and she found that the honesty outweighed the annoyance by enough that she could move forward. "What do we do about it?" she said. "You need to go to the Territorial Land Office in Guthrie," he said. "Not the local office, the main one. You need to file a formal harassment complaint against Sims and name Webb as a co-conspirator in a scheme to defraud land race participants. I can go with you if you'll let me." "When?" "Day after tomorrow," he said. "We'll finish the roof first." The roof of the sod house went on the following day, a work of poplar poles she had sourced from a supplier in the town, laid across the tops of the walls and covered with more sod strips, and finally a layer of tar paper that she had spent 6 of her remaining dollars on and did not regret for a moment. The structure was solid. It was low and dark, and it smelled of earth and prairie grass, and when she stood inside it for the first time with the evening light coming through the single east-facing window she had positioned deliberately to catch the morning, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for years. John Donnelly stood in the doorway behind her, his frame filling most of it, and he was quiet while she had that moment because he understood without being told what it meant. "It's good work," he said when she turned. "It's a good house," she said. And then, because she was tired and honest and the evening had that quality of softness that removed her usual careful management of herself, she said, "Thank you for all of it. For Covenant and for the crew, and for not making me ask for help in a way that felt like defeat." He crossed the small room and stood close to her, closer than he had stood before, and she tipped her face up to look at him, and the firelight from outside came through the window and caught the particular gravity of his expression, that focused, patient quality that she had been refusing to name properly for 11 days. "Lenora," he said, and nothing else for a moment. "John," she said, and she meant it as a warning, and it came out as something else entirely. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, or they arrived at the same point by different routes at the same time, which is sometimes how the most important things happen. It was not a small thing. It was quiet and certain, and had the quality of something both of them had been approaching for long enough that when they arrived it felt less like surprise and more like recognition. She stepped back first, not because she wanted to, but because she was Lenora Vaughn and she did not throw herself at things without thinking them through. "I told you," she said, slightly breathless, "that you were a complication." "You did," he said, and there was warmth in him like banked fire, deep and patient and not going anywhere. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. "Day after tomorrow, Guthrie." "Day after tomorrow, Guthrie," she agreed. He left, and she stood in her sod house on her land in the Oklahoma Territory and thought. She thought for a long time and very thoroughly, the way she thought about everything that mattered. She thought about the 4 years of teaching school and saving money and building toward this specific life. She thought about whether a person could have that life and also have a different kind of life inside it, the kind that involved another person who had walked a horse through a crowd to a stranger at the starting line of a land race, because he had seen that the stranger needed it, and because that was simply the kind of man he was. She decided that perhaps good plans were, as John had said, the ones that knew how to grow. Guthrie was a revelation and a circus, and an argument all happening in the same space. The territorial capital had exploded in the 3 weeks since the race from a tent city to something that was beginning to resemble, in its better moments, an actual town. The land office building on Oklahoma Avenue was surrounded by settlers from morning to night, every one of them with something urgent and complicated to say to the clerks who processed claims and disputes, with the weary efficiency of men who had learned very quickly that Oklahoma Territory operated at a speed and volume that did not forgive slowness. Lenora presented her complaint to the senior land office administrator, a thin man named Morrison who wore a very good suit and had the eyes of someone who had seen every angle of every kind of fraud and was therefore very difficult to impress. She had prepared thoroughly. She had a written record of the $2 paid to the surveyor Webb and the information she had provided him. She had the sworn statement of 2 other race participants who had paid Webb for information, and then discovered that the same information had been passed to Carter Sims' land speculation company, because she had spent the evening before they left for Guthrie talking to settlers she had identified as likely victims of the same scheme. She had a written account of the constable's visit to her property and the claim of an official measurement order, with a request for verification of that order's existence. Morrison read everything she gave him without expression. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at her over the papers and said, "Miss Vaughn, you have done better preparation on this than most of the attorneys who come through my door." "I was a school teacher," she said. "We prepare." John Donnelly, seated beside her, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Morrison opened an investigation the same day. The measurement order turned out to be exactly what Lenora had suspected, a document Sims had fabricated by a compliant notary in the local town, which was a criminal offense under territorial law. Webb the surveyor was summoned for questioning. The investigation would take time, Morrison told her, but the order against construction was immediately voided, and Sims was formally warned that any further interference with her claim would result in criminal charges. They rode back from Guthrie in the late afternoon, and the territory opened around them in the golden light, and Lenora felt something that she identified after a moment as peace, which was uncommon enough in her experience that she took a moment to recognize it. "He won't stop because of a warning," she said. "No," John agreed. "But he'll be more careful, and careful men make mistakes that careless ones don't because they're thinking about too many things at once." "You sound like you know this from experience," she said. "The man in Texas I mentioned," he said. "His name was Harlan Cole. He tried to do the same thing to my employer's land that Sims is trying to do to yours. We went through the proper channels and it took 2 years, but it held." "2 years," she said. "2 years," he said. "But the land is still there and Cole is not." She absorbed that. The sun was dropping toward the horizon and the sky was doing that thing it did in the territory, building colors in layers, deep orange at the horizon, then a band of gold, then green-blue, then the first dark blue of evening overhead. It was extravagant and unnecessary, and she found it helpful. "John," she said. "Yes." "What are you thinking about the future?" she said, and she said it directly because she had decided that directness was the only viable approach, that dancing around it would consume energy better spent on the actual matter. He was quiet for a few strides of the horses. Then he said, "I am thinking that I have 6 miles of territory between my claim and yours, and that 6 miles feels like a significant distance." It is not actually a significant distance, she said. I have ridden twice that for groceries. Lenora, he said. Yes. I am thinking that I would like to court you, he said, properly, with your permission and whatever conditions you want to set. I understand that you have a farm to establish and that your first obligation is to your land and your plans, and I would not ask you to compromise those. But I would like to be present for more of your days than I am currently present for, and I would like that with the kind of wanting that I am not going to pretend is something smaller than it is. She looked at the territory ahead of her and thought about the wanting that she had been managing with considerable effort for the past 2 weeks, and decided that pretending it was something smaller than it was had been exhausting and impractical, and she was done with it. You may court me, she said. My conditions are that I will not compromise my farm work and that I will not be managed or directed or told what I cannot do, and that if you ever do what you did with the surveyor information and keep things from me because you think you're protecting me, I will be very specific about my displeasure. Agreed on all counts, he said, immediately enough that she could tell he had already thought about it. Then we are in agreement, she said. He smiled at the territory, and she smiled at a different piece of it, and they rode home in the falling evening like people who have reached the same conclusion by different roads, and found it considerably better than expected. The summer of 1889 in the Oklahoma Territory was a love story told in practical terms, which was the best kind for Lenora Vaughn. John Donnelly came 6 miles south on most days that were not consumed by the work of his own claim, which was substantial, and he brought himself, and whatever was useful, and asked what needed doing. She never had to ask for help twice, and she never felt managed or pitied, which were the two things she had been most afraid of. He treated her knowledge of her own land as authoritative, which it was, and added his own where he had it, and they built something between them in those months that had the quality of actual partnership. She planted her first wheat crop in late September, when the fall rains made the ground workable. He helped her break the south field, driving the second plow team while she drove the first, the two of them moving in parallel lines across the dark Oklahoma soil in the early morning, with the birds rising out of the grass around them in startled, spiraling groups. She had planted wheat before in Missouri on her father's farm, but never her own. She walked behind the seed drill with her hand trailing in the disturbed soil, feeling the seeds going in, and the feeling was something she had no adequate word for. "You're going to ruin that coat doing that," John said, riding up beside her. "I don't care about the coat," she said. "I know," he said. "I like that you don't care about the coat." Carter Sims' investigation produced results in late October. Webb the surveyor had provided information to the territorial authority that implicated Sims' land company in fraud against 4 other race participants in addition to Lenora, and the Attorney General's office in Guthrie filed charges. Sims himself disappeared from the territory before the charges could be served, which was, the marshal's office informed Lenora, a common response, and one that effectively resolved the problem, since a man who had fled could not contest claims from a distance with any legal effectiveness. The constable who had shown up with the fraudulent measurement order was found to have no actual official standing and was fined. Lenora received the news on a Tuesday morning from a letter delivered to the general store, and she read it standing in the street, and when she was done, she folded the letter very carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and walked to the livery to get her horse and rode 6 miles north to tell John. He was mending fence on the north edge of his property, and he looked up when he heard the hoofbeats and saw her expression and set down the wire stretcher and came toward her. "It's over," she said. He lifted her down from the horse, both hands at her waist, and she let him, which was itself a kind of declaration from a woman who had been getting on and off horses without assistance since she was 7 years old. He held her there for a moment, not tightly, just present, and she put her hands on his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms and breathed. "It's over," he said. "I need to cry for a minute," she said, "and then I am going to be completely fine." Take as long as you need, he said. She cried for approximately 3 minutes, which was exactly as long as it took to release the particular pressure that had been building since the morning she had woken to an empty room that smelled of tobacco and betrayal. Then she stopped, with the clean efficiency of someone who cries when it is warranted and stops when it is done, and she stepped back and straightened her coat. I'm planting potatoes tomorrow, she said. Do you want to help? Yes, he said. She looked at him, at the way the October light came down on the territory and made everything the color of brass and warmth, at the man who had given her his best horse without being asked, and who had been present for every difficult thing since without making himself the subject of any of it. John, she said. Lenora, he said. I am in love with you, she said, because she was that kind of person, the kind that having arrived at the true thing says it. He crossed the distance between them and kissed her in the field in October with the fence half-mended behind him and the territory spreading out in every direction around them. And it was the kind of kiss that is both an answer and a beginning, and she kissed him back with the same thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered to her. I have been in love with you, he said, when they were done, since the moment I saw you standing at that starting line with no horse and no plan, and the exact same expression you had when you drove that plow team, which is the expression of someone who has already decided they're going to win. I have never been without a plan, she corrected. You're right, he said. My apologies. Accepted, she said, and kissed him again. The proposal happened in December, which was earlier than either of them had explicitly discussed, but later than Lenora had privately begun to suspect it would happen, because John Donnelly was a man who moved with intention rather than impulse, and when he had made up his mind about something the direction was clear even if the timing was his own. He came to her sod house on a cold Sunday morning in the first week of December when the territory had received its first hard frost, and the grass was stiff and silver in the morning light. She was making coffee on the iron stove she had acquired in November, the most significant purchase of her autumn, a small cast-iron beauty that transformed the sod house from a shelter into something that felt like a home every time it was lit. The stovepipe went up through a hole she had cut in the roof sod with meticulous care, mortared with clay, checked for fire danger with the obsessiveness of someone who understood that a fire in a sod house was the one danger that could undo everything. He knocked, which he always did, and she told him to come in. He came in and stood in the warm, small room with his hat in his hand and looked at her with that particular quality of settled purpose that she had learned to read as a signal that something important was about to be said. She put down the coffee pot. I have been thinking, he said, about the 6 miles. Yes, she said. And about the fence on the northern boundary of your land and the southern boundary of mine, he said, and the fact that if those were combined rather than separated, the resulting property would be one of the better pieces of land in the Eastern Territory. That's a very practical observation, she said. I am a practical man, he said. You are, she said. And I am in love with you, he said, which is also practical because I cannot think of a person I would rather build the next 50 years with than someone who drove my plow team without being asked, and who prepared a fraud complaint well enough to impress a territorial land office administrator, and who cried for exactly 3 minutes when the pressure broke, and then stopped, and told me she was going to plant potatoes. You counted the 3 minutes, she said. I wasn't going to admit that, he said. John Donnelly, she said. Yes. Are you asking me to marry you, she said, with a property boundary analogy? He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, which she had not anticipated and which struck her somewhere completely unguarded. It was a simple thing, a gold band with a small oval garnet set in it, the color of dark red wine, and it caught the morning light from the east window exactly right. I had it sent from Kansas City, he said. I have been carrying it in my coat for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment. I would have asked sooner, but every time I thought the moment was right, you were either driving a fence post or arguing with the grain merchant, and I thought I should wait until you were at rest. I am rarely at rest, she said. "I have noticed," he said. "I find it one of the most compelling things about you. Lenora, will you marry me?" She stood in her sod house in December with the iron stove warm behind her and the territory outside the window silver with frost, and she thought about all the plans she had made for 4 years that had not included this, and she thought about how John had been right that the best plans were the ones that knew how to grow, and she said yes. They were married in February of 1890 in the small church that the Methodist congregation had raised on the eastern edge of the growing town, a wood-frame building that still smelled of fresh-cut lumber and new beginnings. The congregation was mostly settlers, people who had all come to the territory with their own versions of Lenora's starting line moment, and they came to the wedding with the particular warmth of a community that has been formed by shared hardship, which produces a kind of bond that older, easier communities sometimes lack. Lenora wore her best dress, the blue wool one she had bought in Missouri for teaching school and kept carefully packed for important occasions, and she had a borrowed length of white ribbon in her hair that the boarding house widow had pressed into her hands that morning, with an expression that permitted no refusal. John wore a suit she had not seen before, dark gray and clearly new, and when she came up the aisle to him, which she did alone because she had no father or brother present and had declined the offered arm of a neighbor because this walk was hers, his face did the thing it did in firelight, opening toward her like a door that had been waiting to be opened. The minister said the words and they said theirs, and when John put the ring on her hand, she felt the weight of it settle there with a permanence that was not heavy at all, but was instead the kind of solid that holds rather than burdens. They went home to the sod house that evening, through the February cold, under a sky that was scattering the early stars across the dark blue above the territory, and John lit the stove, and she unpacked the small celebration meal she had prepared the day before, and they ate by lamplight and talked about the spring planting schedule with the easy fluency of two people who have already found each other's rhythm, and it was perhaps the finest evening of Lenora Vaughn Donnelly's life. The spring of 1890 brought the wheat up in long, level rows that made Lenora's heart lift every morning when she walked the south field. The winter wheat she had planted in September was establishing itself with the determined vitality of seed that has found its soil, the green shoots pushing up through the territory earth with a purposefulness that she found deeply personally satisfying. She had planted it right. The preparation had been right. The land was answering. John's cattle operation was beginning to take shape on the northern sections of their combined property. A small herd to start, 23 head of mixed shorthorn stock that he had acquired from a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, driven up in March with help from 2 of the crew members who had built the sod house and who had liked the territory well enough to stay. The land between Lenora's original quarter section and John's, the 6 miles that had once been between them, was now traversed daily in both directions as the farm grew outward from its center in the way that living things grow, filling the space available to them. They began work on a proper wood frame house in April, because the sod house was sufficient for one, but insufficient for 2 people, who intended to fill their life with as many things as they both had in mind. The house was John's project in the sense that he had the carpentry knowledge, but it was Lenora's project in the sense that she had a very clear understanding of what she needed and was entirely prepared to explain it in detail. And the result of this was a house that had a large kitchen and a room for books and east-facing windows on the main floor to catch the morning and enough bedrooms upstairs to accommodate the future. They were both quietly and somewhat shyly beginning to contemplate in concrete terms. She was pregnant by May, which she discovered with the particular combination of joy and serious logistical thinking that characterized her approach to most important events. She told John on a morning when they were walking the wheat field together, watching the grain heads forming, and he stopped walking and turned to her, and the expression on his face was one she kept with her for the rest of her life. He had been afraid, she understood later. Not of the child, but of the vulnerability of it, the particular terror that comes with loving someone enough that the prospect of anything happening to them reorganizes your entire understanding of the world and what can be lost in it. His father and mother had lost 2 children young, and that specific grief had marked the family in ways he carried without always recognizing. He was afraid, and he was also more full of light than she had ever seen him, and he held both of those things simultaneously in the way that real feeling requires, without resolving one into the other. "Are you well?" he said first. "Is everything?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am going to continue to walk the wheat field and drive the team and do my work for as long as that is medically sensible. And then I am going to stop driving the team but continue everything else. And I would like you to please not treat me as though I am made of something that breaks, because I will find it very difficult to be patient about that." "I know," he said. He took her hand, the one with the garnet ring, and held it carefully. "I know you will." "Good," she said. And then she leaned against him in the wheat field with the spring wind moving through the grain around them, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a long time without saying anything, watching the territory be exactly what they had both come here for it to be. Their son was born in January of 1891, in the new frame house, with the help of a midwife named Clara Briggs, who had come to the territory the previous summer, and had established herself as the most competent medical practitioner in the eastern county. He was born at dawn, which Lenora would always consider appropriate, and he came into the world with the emphatic vitality of someone who had decided early on that he intended to make his presence known. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's directness of expression, and they named him Thomas, for John's father, who had built and lost and built again and died before he could see his son build something that would hold. John held Thomas on the first morning of his life and looked at him with the kind of love that does not have adequate words in any language, and Lenora watched from the bed where she was resting and felt something complete itself inside her. "He looks like he already has opinions," John said. "He comes by that honestly," she said. He brought his eyes from the baby to her, and the quality of what was in them made her reach out and take his hand. He took it. They sat in the new house in January, with the stove warm and the territory outside the windows white with the first snow of the year, and the baby between them, and nothing that needed to be said. The wheat harvest of 1891 was good. Not spectacular in the way that a lucky year produces, but the solid, reliable good that a well-prepared field and sound farming practice produces, which Lenora valued considerably more because it was repeatable. She sold the crop to the grain merchant in town at a price she had spent 3 days negotiating, because she had done her research on market prices and had the leverage of a crop quality that she knew was demonstrably above average, and the merchant knew it too, and they arrived at a number that was fair by any reasonable measure. She deposited the proceeds in the Territorial Bank in Guthrie, which had opened the previous spring, and she came home and sat at the kitchen table with her ledger book, and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that they were, by any honest measure, doing well. Not wealthy, not free of the 1,000 contingencies that farming life in the territory placed before a person every season, but building, solidly, and in the right direction. She showed the ledger to John after supper, with Thomas asleep upstairs in the bedroom that had been built with this precise purpose in mind, and John looked at the numbers with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not doubted they would arrive at this number, but is glad to see it confirmed. "We should put the south field in corn this coming year," she said. "Rotate it. The soil is ready for a nitrogen fixing cycle." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw you looking at it last Thursday." He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and he said, "Lenora Vaughn Donnelly, you are remarkable." "I know," she said. "So are you, John Donnelly. Don't forget it." He smiled at her in the lamplight, and it was the same smile he had given her the first day, the slow sunrise kind, and she felt it exactly as she had felt it then, all the way through. The years that followed were full in the way that a good life fills itself, not with empty spectacle but with the genuine material of living. The farm grew. The cattle herd grew. Thomas grew, from a loud and opinionated infant into a loud and opinionated toddler, and then a child who could already sit a horse at 3 with the natural ease of someone who had been born at the intersection of two people who understood animals. A daughter came in 1893, whom they named Margaret for Lenora's mother, and she arrived with the calm certainty of someone who had decided the world was a reasonable place, and she intended to explore it thoroughly, which proved accurate. Lenora built a school. This was perhaps the achievement that gave her the most particular satisfaction, the one that connected the person she had been in Missouri with the person she had become in the territory. The eastern county was filling with settlers' children who were receiving no education, and the nearest established school was 12 miles away, and this was a situation she found unacceptable and therefore addressed. She organized a school committee among the settler families, raised money through a series of events that she planned and executed with the same thoroughness she brought to planting season, secured a land donation for the building site from the county authority, and hired a teacher who had come from Ohio with a teaching certificate and a willingness to live where she was needed. John built the schoolhouse. He built it with the crew and with the help of half a dozen settler men who showed up on the building days, because that was the kind of community the territory produced. People who understood that a thing which benefits everyone requires everyone's effort. The building went up in 2 weeks, a proper wood-frame schoolhouse with a bell that Lenora had ordered from a catalog in Kansas City, and on the morning they hung the bell and it rang for the first time across the territory. She stood in the schoolyard with Thomas beside her and Margaret on her hip and listened to it carry across the grass and felt the continuity of it. That sound traveling outward from this place, the way her mother's patient teaching had traveled outward from a classroom in Missouri to produce a woman who could drive a plow team and build a sod house and argue her case before a territorial land office and know, when someone gave her a horse at the moment, she needed one. Most, what kind of man she was dealing with. The years put down their roots. Thomas learned to work the farm with the serious dedication of a boy who understands that the land is not a backdrop to life but the thing itself. Margaret learned to read at 4 and read everything she could reach and then reached for more, which satisfied Lenora in ways she could not fully articulate. The farm produced well. The cattle herd produced well. The territory became, in degrees, a state, Oklahoma joining the Union in 1907, and Lenora and John stood outside the courthouse in Guthrie to watch the celebration with their 4 children around them. Because 2 more had come, a second son named William in 1896 and a third daughter named Clara in 1899, named for the midwife who had brought Thomas into the world and who had become one of Lenora's closest friends. She thought, on the day Oklahoma became a state, about a starting line and a pistol shot and 2,000 riders, and a man who had walked a horse through a crowd to a stranger who had nothing. She thought about how much of what surrounded her on this day had grown from that single act of uncomplicated human goodness, not as a chain of causes and effects, but as a kind of permission, the permission to believe that the world contained people who would help without being asked, and that such a world was one worth building in. John was beside her, had been beside her for 18 years. He was not the young man who had stood at the starting line anymore. Neither was she, the young woman who had ridden across the territory with borrowed reins and everything to prove. They were something other than those people, not replacements for them, but the form those people had grown into, the way a seedling becomes the tree that was always inside it. He was still careful and direct and patient in that particular way that had been the first thing she had recognized in him as something real. She was still thorough and uncompromising, and inclined to know more about any given subject than anyone around her expected. They still argued sometimes, with the productive friction of two people who are both deeply certain of themselves and have learned that the other's certainty is usually worth taking seriously. They still laughed, often, with the easy frequency of people who have spent enough time together to find each other genuinely funny rather than performing amusement. Covenant lived to be 26 years old, which was a long life for a horse and suited him, because he was not the kind of animal who did anything by halves. He spent his last years in the paddock near the barn, no longer ridden but still consulted, Lenora thought privately, in the way that certain presences are consulted simply by being near them. Thomas learned to ride on Covenant, in the early years when the horse still had the patience and the energy for a small boy, and the sight of her son on that horse in the October light was something she kept in a particular part of herself that she thought of as the treasury, the place where the things that were too good to examine too closely were stored for safekeeping. When Covenant died in the spring of the year Thomas turned 15, she walked out to the paddock in the morning and stood with the horse for a long time before she called anyone, and she said things to him that she would not have said in front of another person. She thanked him. She told him that he had been the beginning of everything, which was not entirely true in the literal sense, but was true in the way that a door is the beginning of everything that is inside a house, because without the door you would never have gotten in. She told him that she had loved him, which was also true. John buried him in the south corner of the pasture, and they did not talk about it much, because some things are not for talking about. But he brought her coffee that evening without being asked, and sat beside her on the porch in the April dusk, and she put her head on his shoulder for a while, and watched the territory evening come down gold and quiet over the farm that had begun with a horse and a set of reins, and a hand that had brushed hers in the transfer. Thomas, at 20, was showing every sign of becoming the kind of farmer that his mother would respect, and his father could be proud of, which in practical terms meant someone who understood the land as a relationship rather than a resource and who worked it accordingly. He had his mother's analytical thoroughness and his father's patience, a combination that Lenora privately believed was the best possible arrangement for a person who intended to work with soil and seasons, and the particular unpredictability of weather in the Oklahoma Territory. He also had a girl he was courting, the daughter of a settler family to the east, a young woman named Ruth Harmon who had her own opinions and expressed them clearly and had once, Lenora was told, driven a fence line herself when the hired hand was sick rather than leave it undone. When Thomas brought her for Sunday dinner for the first time, Lenora shook her hand and said that she'd heard Ruth had driven the fence herself, and Ruth said yes. It had needed doing, and Lenora said that was the right answer, and John caught her eye across the table, and they shared the particular look of two people who have accumulated enough history together to communicate entire paragraphs with a glance. Margaret went to the university at Norman in 1910, the first year she was old enough, on a scholarship for which she had applied with the help of a letter of recommendation from her teacher and one from her mother, who had written in terms that left no doubt about the intellectual quality of the applicant, and had probably been significantly more impressive than Margaret's own application, though she would never admit this. Margaret studied literature and history, and came home in the summers changed in the way that genuine education changes a person, expanding rather than replacing, adding new rooms to the house rather than knocking down the walls. She was brilliant and sometimes difficult and completely herself in a way that made Lenora fiercely and quietly proud. William and Clara grew up behind them in the way that younger children grow in busy households, somewhat in the shadow of their elder siblings' established territory, but finding their own through the particular determination that middle and youngest children develop. William had John's love of livestock, and expanded it into a passion for horse breeding, working with a neighboring rancher to learn the careful art of selection and training that produces exceptional animals. Clara had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, A talent for mathematics that expressed itself in the school accounts, she began managing at 15 when the teacher needed help with the budget, and which led eventually to a career in bookkeeping that took her to Oklahoma City and then beyond. The farm produced through the good years and the lean years, because Lenora had built it on principles rather than on luck, and principles hold when luck does not. There were dry years when the wheat came up thin and the worry was real and present, and they made the adjustments that responsible farmers make, rotating differently, drawing on the savings she had maintained with the same discipline she had applied to saving her original $63. There were good years when the harvest was abundant, and the grain merchant met the price she asked without the 3-day negotiation, and those years they reinvested in the land and the buildings, and the people who worked with them. John's hair went gray at his temples first and then more generally, and she told him once that it suited him, and he looked at her with the expression that was specifically reserved for moments when she said something he had not expected, which happened less often than it used to but still happened, and he said he would take her word for it. Her own hair she wore pulled back in the style she had worn since Missouri, and when the gray came into it, she noted it and continued as before, because she had never particularly defined herself by her appearance and saw no reason to begin. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the work allowed it, which in the later years was more often than in the early ones, and they watched the territory shift through its colors, the green of spring and the gold of summer and the copper of fall and the silver of winter, and they talked or were quiet in roughly equal measure, and both were good. "Do you remember the starting line?" she asked him once, on an October evening when the air had the first real cold of autumn and the wheat stubble in the south field was pale gold in the late light. "I remember everything about the starting line," he said. "You were very calm," she said. "I thought about that afterward." Most people were not calm that morning. "I was not as calm as I looked," he said. "Because of the horse," she said. "Because of you," he said. "I had walked Covenant over to you and I was holding the reins and you were looking at me like you were deciding whether I was trustworthy, which was exactly the right thing to be deciding, and I very much wanted to be the right answer." "You were," she said. "I know," he said. It still felt uncertain in the moment. She looked at him in the October light, this man who had been present for every important thing for 30 years, who had given her his best horse before she had any reason to give him anything in return, who had built with her on both sides of the 6 miles that no longer existed as a distance between them. "You gave me Covenant," she said. "Do you know what I thought when you walked up with him?" "What did you think?" "I thought it was a trick," she said. "That you wanted something. That there was a catch." "There was a catch," he said. She turned to look at him. "The catch was that I knew I'd want to see how it turned out," he said. "And that meant I was going to have to come back and talk to you. And I already understood that talking to you was going to be significantly more complicated than anything else that was happening in Oklahoma territory that year." She laughed, the real laugh, the one she had first heard from herself crossing the Spring Creek on Covenant's back, and it came easily now with the ease of something long established. "You were right," she said. "I usually am," he said. "Don't push it," she said. He took her hand, the one with the garnet ring that she still wore, and held it in both of his the way he had held it on the first evening she had told him she loved him, with the careful completeness of someone who understands the weight of what they are holding. The territory lay around them in the October evening, the fields and the pastures and the house they had built, and the school with the bell that rang across the grass every morning, all of it rooted in this earth that she had driven her stake into 30 years ago, when nobody at the starting line had thought she would make it, when the laughter had followed her out across the plains. Nobody had cheered for her at the starting line except the man who had given her the best horse. It had been enough. It had been, in fact, everything. She turned her hand in his and held him back, and the evening settled around them in the amber light of a life well and honestly lived, and the territory stretched outward to every horizon, solid and real and theirs, the land that had been the beginning of the answer to the question of what Lenora Vaughn was made of. The answer, it turned out, was not so different from what the land itself was made of. Patient, deep running, capable of producing extraordinary things when properly cared for. Better, in the end, than anyone watching from the sidelines had believed it could be. And in the morning, there would be the wheat field to walk and the accounts to check and the letter from Margaret to answer, and the new foal in William's paddock to examine, and Clara's latest letter from Oklahoma City to Reed and Thomas and Ruth coming for Sunday dinner, and all the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of days that are too full of the real to have room for anything smaller than living. And she would walk into all of it with the same purposeful stride she had carried since Missouri, since before Missouri, since the very beginning of herself. John would be beside her, as he had been beside her through every field and every season, and the garnet ring would catch the morning light from the east window, and somewhere in the pasture the horses would be moving through the long grass, and the territory would be the territory, immense and indifferent and beautiful, offering itself to whoever had the courage to come and ask for it. She had come, she had asked, she had built, and she would not trade a single step of it.